Amendment number 11 are is the amendment that talks about state lawsuits. And what do we do when we have disagreements among the states where the states are going to sue one another, or we have an individual that wants to sue the state over an issue? And so Amendment number 11 clarified that just a little bit. But any of the lawsuits that concern the states have to be in the state's own court system unless the state agrees to move that otherwise. So you can't take an issue with the state of Indiana and go to Illinois and try to sue the state of Indiana from the Illinois court system unless Indiana allows that to happen. And so helps to clarify that a little bit. I'm not concerned that you know a ton about number 11. It doesn't come up extremely often, but it does provide some order among the states and how those lawsuits go. Number 12 is a really important one, though. Number 12 changes the way that we elect our president and vice president. So we had a problem with the way in which we originally intended for our president and vice president to get their offices. In the original system, because George Washington didn't want to have political parties, he said, let's take the top vote getter, give them the title of president, and whoever has the second most votes in the Electoral College, you become the vice president. Well, that didn't pan out so well with presidents number 2 and 3, and so we started to rethink this idea just a little bit. Instead of having people from opposing political parties in the same office, let's make sure that we have people that have the same agenda that can work together and accomplish a whole lot more for the government. So, Amendment number 12 changed the way that we elect the president, vice president. I think of this one here as number 1 and number 2 in our country. You put those together, Amendment number 12. And so you have president and vice president together on the same ticket, but they're elected separately in the Electoral College. When we get to the Electoral College, we'll explain that a little bit more. So for right now, you just need to know that number 12 talks about how we elect the president and vice president, and it ensures the fact that we'll get the same party members in those two offices. It also designates for what happens if we have a tie. If there is a tie in the Electoral College, then the House is the one who is going to deal with the presidential, and the Senate is going to deal with the vice presidential. And the vice president also has to have the same qualifications as the president. In the event that something happens, then he can take over and not have any constitutional problems there. Number 13 abolishes slavery. So number 13, 14, and 15 are the slavery or Civil War amendments. And so we kind of group those together. Number 13 was a direct result of the fact that many people questioned whether the Emancipation Proclamation was actually a legal document or not. That still is in question for a lot of historians as far as whether Abraham Lincoln went beyond his constitutional powers to draft that and enforce it. And so Amendment number 13 clarified that and just said, okay, as a nation, we are going to outlaw slavery. It's no longer allowed anywhere within our borders. And so because the Emancipation Proclamation only talked about abolishing slavery in the South, this one includes all the states and also includes the wording involuntary servitude, which encompasses all of that. Number 14 had to clarify who is a citizen. So even though number 13 freed the slaves, no more slavery, it didn't give them rights to citizenship. And so number 14 does a lot of things. Number one, it says that all persons, regardless of color or race, who are born in America or naturalized, will become citizens. There's a lot of implication in that, because that also means that if somebody is here that has come over illegally, but yet they have a child who is born in these borders, they could claim the 14th Amendment as a legal path to citizenship for their child. And then because of that and the way our laws work, many times if the child is a citizen, it makes it easier for mom and dad to become a citizen. And you can just imagine how that's going to impact those who are considering coming to our nation and trying to skip the line and trying to go ahead of the legal process that we have. So some have found that loophole, and some politicians are trying to close that and trying to determine, is this something we need to adapt? So citizenship is a part of this. We also have the Due process comes back in Amendment number 14 and clarifies how due process is applicable for all people, regardless of their background, regardless of their ethnicity. Due process is guaranteed to all people and equal protection under the law for all people. Many Jim Crow laws are going to come up in the South at the end of the Civil War. And this was an attempt to try to combat those, but unfortunately many of them still continued on. And that's why we had to have Amendment number 15 that defined the voting rights for citizens in America. So even though the slaves were freed in Amendment number 13, they were given citizenship in number 14, we had to actually lay it out in black and white here in the writing of the amendments. Number 15 says that all people who are legal citizens of age are able to vote. Now at this time, it's still men and it does not include women yet. Many people thought that was going to be changed here, especially many of the women who were pushing for women's suffrage. They thought it was going to come in Amendment number 15, and when the wording came out, it did not, and that did not go over well. But Amendment 15 says that you cannot restrict voting rights to anyone because of their race, color, or former slave status. It eliminated things like the grandfather clause. So they would use things like, well, if your grandfather could vote, then you can vote. Or if you pass a certain literacy test, then you can vote. Or we would have a concept known as gerrymandering, where they would redraw the district lines so that way the vote would favor the white voters or the white candidate, and it would eliminate the power of the black vote. And those things were all done. They were not necessarily illegal until the 15th Amendment, but the 15th Amendment cast those down and said, you can't do those things anymore. We want to have it fair and equal for everyone in those. Number 16, I often think of as the amendment that comes into play when you get your first job, because it is dealing with income tax. And so I think I get my driver's license at 16, I need a job to pay for the gas for that car, and so I now start paying income tax. 16 is income tax. This was important to help make sure that we could pay our bills as a nation. As a growing country, we were now needing to spend more money, and therefore we had to start taxing American incomes. This happens in the early 1900s. I can't remember the exact year, but amendment number 16 there. No. Number 17 is a direct election of senators. Prior to this amendment, our senators were elected by the state representatives. So in the Capitol building of each state, they would determine who they wanted to send to Washington as their senator. As you can imagine, knowing the corruption that comes in the latter half of the 1800s, this became problematic. There was a lot of money being handed under the table, a lot of benefits being passed around in order to get people in those Senate seats. And it was just, you were getting people there that really didn't belong. And so to clean up government, Amendment number 17 was passed, which said that the citizens of the state will now directly elect their senators, and it will not be chosen for them by their state representatives. So number 17 was a big one there. Number 18 is prohibition of alcohol. Now notice that prohibition did not connect on one key point. Prohibition outlawed the sale, the manufacture, and the transport of alcohol. It didn't say anything about drinking it. But if you can't sell it or buy it, and you can't transport it and you can't make it, the only way to drink it is if you obtain it illegally. And so that is what led to a lot of the criminal activity that went on in the 1920s. Made a lot of people a whole bunch of money during that time. But because that criminal activity was not being taxed, there was a lot of money that was being lost in the government funding. And so there were a lot of people at the end of the Great Depression, or at the beginning of the Great Depression, who were calling for, let's bring back the alcohol so we can collect the tax money. And eventually, of course, that's going to happen. Number 19 gives women the right to vote. And so with this one, they had campaigned for this for quite some time. Women's suffrage is women's right to vote. Not a whole lot else we need to know about that, other than the fact that it took way too long for that to come into play. And this is Amendment number 19. Amendment number 20 is a lame duck amendment. So lame duck means that we are dealing with a president who is still in office, but they've not been reelected. So this happens with a two-term president, generally speaking, in the last 2 years of his presidency. Everybody knows he's leaving office in 2 years. There's a limit on how much he's going to be able to do, and so we're kind of coasting through the end of his term until he no longer is going to be in office. We're looking ahead to the next guy. This also happens with senators, representatives, anybody who does not get reelected. So the way that this was originally set up was that the election happens in November, inauguration and the new Congress took over in March. There were 5 months to help get this person ready for his new position. And that was, we found out, was way too long, because that meant that an individual had 5 months then to do some things. Take, for example, John Adams. That he could do some things on his way out that could be potentially very dangerous to the government, knowing that he's not going to be reelected or not going to come back for the next term. And so they shortened the lame duck period from March back to January. So Amendment number 20 changes the inauguration date from March 4th to January 20th, and it also requires that Congress meets January 3rd, or near that time, to introduce and to acquaint all the new members.